Hi and welcome back to Module 8, which is on network attached storage. Now before we start talking about the two protocols, NFS and CIFS, there's something else we have to get out of the way. It's very important to realize that the location of a volume that the client wants to access is irrelevant. So if you have, for example, a 4-node cluster, then a client can access the data live of the first node in the cluster, will be able to access a volume that is local, but it will also be able to access a volume that is not local to the LIF's location. The data will be transferred via the cluster interconnect from the first node, in this case, to the third node, and back again to the first node, and then back to the client. So also this means that a volume can be moved around. So you can move your volume from one node to another node, and your client will not be affected by that. So it's completely transparent where the volume is located when you access NAS volumes. To give you an overview of the data flow, let's have a look at the following two pictures. First, client accesses the LIF, then the data will be received by the network module. If you talk about LUNs, then it will be the SCSI module, but we're talking about network attached storage, so data will be received by the network module. The network module will copy the data to the session manager, and the session manager will then check where the volume is located. This information is stored in the VLDB, which is the volume location database on vol0 of every node in the cluster. So the session manager will see that the volume is located locally, is hosted by the node itself. Then the data will be copied to the data module, which includes Waffle, and Waffle will then write the data to the volume. If, however, your volume is not located locally, then the session manager will determine that based on the contents of vol0, the volume is located on a different node, and it will use the cluster interconnect to contact the other node, send the data to the other node. That particular node will send the data to the data module, and then ultimately the data will be written to the volume. Talking about file system types, we are talking about network-based file systems. We're not talking about disk-based file systems, memory-based file systems. We're talking about network-based file systems. That means that you access a file system which is hosted on a particular node via a network protocol. And the two network protocols that we'll be talking about is a network file system and common internet file system, which is actually SMB, but that's for later. So NFS has a couple of versions, version 3, version 4, and version 4.1. CIFS also has a couple of versions, SMB 1 through 3. The very important thing is that your volume has to be mounted. If the volume is not mounted in the namespace of the storage virtual machine, that the volume will not be accessible. So you have to mount the volume in order to be able to access it via any of the two protocols. Another thing to realize is that the client does not have administrative control over the file system. So NetApp hosts the file system, and your client can only copy files, read files, create files, delete files, etc., but it will not be able to do any administrative work on that file system. So your client will not be able to grow the file system, or to shrink the file system, or to repair the file system. So file system management is not performed by clients, but it's performed by NetApp itself. If your client wants to access the file system, then if you talk about the CIFS share, that will be a drive letter usually that is connected to a shared volume based on a share name. And if you talk about NFS, there will be a mount point on the client. In this example, you see that the mount point is /mnt/datavol, and it is mounted to the SVM and the mount point inside the storage virtual machine's namespace. Okay, and another thing is that whether you run NFS or CIFS, both worlds will be able to access a particular volume. So you can export your volume using NFS, and you can export it or share it using CIFS based on something which is called a security style. your client will be able to access the volume and write to the volume or read from the volume. And the security styles are Unix, NTFS, and mixed. Basically, this means if, for example, you specify that the security style is Unix, then only the Unix inodes will be used to determine the permissions. If you say that the security style is NTFS, then the Unix inode will not be used to check the permissions, but the ACL will be used to check the permissions. And if you say the security style is going to be mixed, then either of the two can be used, and the one that has been changed last will be the active one. I'm not going to go into that right now, but using security style mixed is not something that you actually would want, because that will give you problems. We'll talk about that later. Now, before we can set up NFS, we have to do some preparations. First of all, we have to configure the client. Is the correct software installed? And do we have a mount point to connect the volume to? And for the SVM, we have to create a live, create and mount a volume, and we have to enable NFS for that particular SVM. So let's have a look at that. So we start with two windows, one for the cluster and one for the Linux VM. Let's have a look at Linux first. Do we have the correct software installed for NFS? And the first one is libnfs IDmap, which is for NFS version 4. And the second one is the important one right now, which is for the NFS utilities to be able to mount and things like that. Then we create a directory, which is mntcl1 222, to resemble the IP address of the virtual machine, the storage virtual machine that we want to access. And the IP address is 222, and that's why we call the mount point 222, which is completely arbitrary, I know, but to keep things simple. Then we create a volume inside the storage virtual machine. The volume is going to be created in aggregate 1 of node 2, and it's going to be 500 megabytes. And the junction path is /nfs1. So when we do vol show fields, it will tell us that it is mounted to /nfs1. So this is also what we have to access then. So we've got the root volume of the storage virtual machine mounted to /, and the first volume is going to be mounted to /nfs1. So now we have to enable NFS in the storage virtual machine. So we enable it, and when we list the vServer properties, it will tell us that version 3 is enabled, version 4 and version 4.1 are both disabled. And we're done.